Hello everyone, welcome to SVGA, and today I'm going to be talking about the difference between making a game from scratch and making a game using an engine. I have two examples of games that I'm going to show you. One that I'm actually writing for DOS so that it will run on older machines like 386 machines, maybe even 286 machines, and one that I'm writing in an engine for modern machines or for mobile that is written in an engine called the Godot engine. Some people call it Godot, some people call it Godot. So I'm going to use Godot. So the first game I actually have up here on the screen right now. Both of these games are just kind of prototype games right now. There's not much going on as far as graphics or functionality. We basically have some basic graphics, we have movement, and very basic collisions. So this first game is a game that I'm writing from scratch. I'm actually writing this in Quick Basic so that it can be run on older DOS machines. So kind of a legacy game. You can see it's a top-down game and you can just move it around right now. A lot of these graphics were actually created by my 5-year-old son. So there is collisions going on right now, and there are these little portals you can go through. There's basic movement of the graphics, and that is about it. There's really no other functionality right now. It's just kind of a sandbox that I can work with to design the game. I have a lot of ideas for the game, but nothing's really implemented right now. If we were to end this game really quick and go look at the code, we can see that the code is here, and it's around 400 lines long right now. So this is the code for this game. This is written from scratch, meaning all of the graphics are brought in from raw data. All of the movement, all of the collision detection, everything is written in code. None of it is done for you by the engine. There are no libraries that I'm using that do things like collision detection or anything with graphics or movement or anything to that effect. So about 400 lines of code to create just basic graphics and movement, not really much going on there. Now let's look at the next example. So this is a game that I'm writing in the Godot engine, and it is also a 2D game. And right now there is a basic movement of a 2D character. So this is actually a side scroller, a little different, but it still is the same concept in that we have movement, we have some basic collisions, and really not much else going on. Now you can argue that this game is actually quite a bit more complicated because I have movement around, but I also have jumping, so I have a gravity system. I even have, if I were to do this here, whoop, not very good. I have wall jumps built in. You see I just did a little wall jump there. And I call this game Gravitron. You can actually switch the gravity, and so it's just kind of based around that gameplay. In terms of just kind of playing around with the gravity and moving around. I can kind of jump here. Let's jump, and we'll switch the gravity, and we'll go back up like that. We can go around and go like that. And just jump back over. Whoop. Yeah. Okay. It's really fun to play around with, actually. But anyway, so obviously there's collisions, actually quite more complex collisions, and I can scale up the collisions and objects much more easily in an engine. And if we look at the code here, it's actually only around 50 lines of code because all of the graphics, all of the collisions and everything like that is all built in. I can use existing libraries for all of those things. So I don't have to write that. So in terms of lines of code and speed of development, obviously the engine is much better. So let's talk about some of the differences that we would see in these games in terms of development and the kind of the trade-offs. Obviously, we've seen that you're going to have to write a lot less code here to make a game in an engine. The code that I've written here mostly accounts for the movement and gravity, and that's really about it. Everything else is pretty much done for me by the engine. So a pretty simple game to make in an engine. Now, like I said, the other game, the top-down game for DOS, that's written from scratch. However, my goal with writing a kind of a legacy game like this is that the entire game will fit in a very small amount of memory space. I'm aiming for around 64 kilobytes. So that would be all of the graphics in memory, all of the code for functionality, everything like that, all of the maps, which would of course be procedurally generated to save memory space, but overall, a very small game. It would also run very quickly. I have lots and lots of control over this game compared to the control that I have with the engine. I should clarify what I mean by that. We actually have pretty much the same amount of control with the engine if we write code to do things. It's just using the engine, the point of it is to take advantage of the built-in libraries of code so that we don't have to write them ourselves. In that way, we sacrifice the control that we have in this game, right? But we get development time as the trade-off. It takes a lot less time to make a much more complex game with many more features. Obviously, it's not portable in terms of technology that is very old, but I think that's not a concern for most people developing games. There's some novelty to creating a game that can run on old hardware, but overall, people aren't really doing that anymore. Although there is a little bit of trend toward retro gaming and retro systems. But the work of it is quite complex. For example, take this main sprite. So I've created this sprite, and I actually can't, you see how there's transparency there? That is not something that's built in. I don't just have a transparent graphic. All I can do is say what's on the screen at any given point in time. So I actually have to control the background and the sprite at any point in time. I have to copy the background and copy it over the sprite in order to make it look like the sprite is moving. And to do the transparency, I actually have to have two graphics for each sprite. One is the sprite itself, and one is a mask that I use bitwise operations to put the sprite onto the background with the mask in order to mimic this transparency type of effect. I believe we can see that in the code somewhere here. If I were to look at the code, I'm not really sure where. Here we go. So this is the basic idea. We actually have to put the background and the sprite and with an AND operation, and then my mask with an AND operation and my sprite with an OR operation. So it's quite complex to make a game that does that. However, if I go to my Godot game, none of that is going on in the code. In fact, I'm simply I can use sprites that are PNG files that have transparency built in. And there's really not much that you have to do there. It's all done for you. Now, in terms of the overall size of the game engine is generally going to produce a larger game because you are using built-in libraries. You are not choosing what code you're using, really. You didn't write that code itself. The code can be very robust, although modern compilers are good. And you're typically only including the final game code that your game actually needs to run in the compiled version. So it is efficient in terms of the amount of code from the game libraries or the API that you are using. So overall, maybe your code will be pretty efficient, but in general, it's going to take up more space. Your graphics are probably high resolution as well. They'll take up more space. Overall, your game's going to take up more space. But again, we don't sacrifice development time. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is, as a seasoned developer, I've been writing code for about 25 years before game engines were really in use, heavily at least. And having that background means when I use an engine, I'm actually approaching it in a different way. A lot of times, if I can code something, I will just code it myself so that I have it work exactly the way I want it. It may be that there's something in the API to do collisions the way you want to do enemy AI, or many different things that you could do that are actually built into the engines. These engines are huge and they do so many different things. However, sometimes I don't look up what those are. I just code myself whatever I want the engine to do. And so, or whatever I want the game to do rather. And so because of that, my games tend to be slightly different in features than other games that might be developed with an engine. Most of my games that I develop are just for fun, although some are for teaching purposes. So it's interesting that engines have a really big advantage in that beginners can use them because, for example, the Godot engine just uses a simple scripting language that looks basically like Python called GDScript. and it's very easy to use. Python is an easy language to use. It's a good language for beginners. However, when you really dig into it, you can use these libraries or the API to develop really, really featureful games. However, you don't necessarily have to know what's going on in that underlying code that you're calling on to do a lot of the work for you. So it's a good way to create something very complex and featureful without knowing a lot about code. And so if you are a beginner, I actually think games are a really good way to start. However, your games are going to be a lot different than those of a seasoned developer who might decide to code something themselves rather than using the built-in tech of the engine. That's what's really cool about engines, is even though so much is done for you, depending on the developer, you end up with vastly different games with vastly different features. Although we also do see a lot of games come out that are very, very similar, but I think that's just because of people mirroring successful gameplay to try to create a successful game that sells, rather than the engine itself. So if we had to have a contest between what's the best thing to use right now, a game engine or a game from scratch, there really is no contest. The game engine is to be used if you want to create a really cool game quickly. And in general, I think the game engine wins out. The creating game code from scratch, however, does have its advantages as well. You can create small, memory-efficient games that run very quickly on older systems. Also, if you've already created games with a game engine and you want to hone your coding skills and do more coding manually, managing the memory, really worrying about a lot of the lower level stuff even that's going on in a game, you can write a game from scratch, and that would help you with that as well. There are also other really cool game engines that are kind of in between, like the Pixel game engine, which is a really neat engine, and I forget the YouTuber that created it, but I think it's One Lone Coder, and he created the Pixel game engine. It's a really cool engine. It's not going to do everything for you like Godot or Unity, but it is an in-between that lets you do a lot but still have a lot of control over the code. And so that is something that's also an option. So I just basically wanted to show you a game that's being coded from scratch and one that's being coded using a game engine, discuss some of the differences. There's so many more things you could talk about, so many trade-offs. You could talk about this for a long, long, long time, and many people have. But if you have anything that I missed or you want to mention that's a reason that you might code a game from scratch like this, or that you might use a game engine like this, let me know in the comments. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you soon.